Chapter 2 Judgment Day. On September 11th, Alec Station held down a small area of the DCI Counter-Terrorist Center, a windowless expanse of cubicles and computers on the ground floor of the new headquarters building. It was the worst office space at the CIA, in the opinion of some who worked there. It felt like a bunker. During the last days of the Cold War, the Soviet East Europe Division had occupied the floor. Its impermeability would thwart the KGB's eavesdroppers, the thinking went. The CIA's Russia hands eventually found better quarters, and CTC moved in. The center was a bureaucratic stepchild. It had been founded in 1986 as an experiment, a place where analysts, typically writers and researchers with graduate degrees but no operating experience on the street, might work alongside or even supervise case officers, also known as operations officers, the career spies who recruited agents and stole secrets. The CIA's case officer cadre enjoyed the greatest prestige and power at the agency. It was not natural for them to collaborate with analysts. It was akin to creating teams of detectives and college professors to solve crimes. Senior CIA leaders advised newly minted case officers to avoid CTC because being assigned there might inhibit promotions and overseas assignments. Yet during the late 1990s, as terrorism evolved amid post-Cold War disorder, the Counter-Terrorist Center's budget more than doubled, including one-time supplemental appropriations, while the rest of the CIA dealt with flat or declining budgets. By September 2001, there were about 350 people working at CTC. About 3 or 4 dozen worked in overseas stations, but most of the rest were jammed into the new headquarters bunker. Besides Alec Station, the center housed branches and sections assigned to Sunni extremist groups other than Al Qaeda, such as Hamas, as well as ideologically diverse groups such as Hezbollah, a Shiite Islamic faction based in Lebanon, Colombian guerrillas, mainly Marxist and secular, yet operating within a Catholic country, the Tamil Tigers in Sri Lanka, Hindu and ethnically nationalist, yet fighting for autonomy in a Buddhist-majority country, the Japanese Red Army, a fragment of the Cold War, and more than 6 dozen other targets. The office featured low-grade industrial carpeting and cookie-cutter government cubicles. It was poorly lit and smelled vaguely sour. Wanted posters of grim-looking terrorist fugitives, including Osama bin Laden, decorated the walls. In an attempt at relief, someone had mounted fake windows looking out on beaches and palm trees. A job at CTC came with a certain dark glamour and a life-saving mission, but the federal government's general schedule salaries were no better than at the Department of Agriculture. The CIA's bureaucracy was thick and intrusive. The agency's counterintelligence division, charged with detecting traitors and other abusers of security clearances, surveyed the workforce and administered polygraphs that could be highly unpleasant, no matter how diligent and loyal the person examined might be. Mid-level CIA managers could be lazy or cantankerous or stupid or all three. Federal employment rules made it difficult to do anything about poor performers, short of proof of theft or felony violence. Overall, CTC's employees liked their jobs better than typical CIA employees did in the summer of 2001, according to an internal survey. They knew their mission mattered. Yet Alec Station's analysts suffered from information overload. They handled more than 200 incoming cables a day from other parts of CIA, plus another 200 or more from the Pentagon, State Department, the National Security Agency, and elsewhere. Dozens of these were action cables, requiring a prompt reply or follow-up. The analysts often felt stressed. About a third of CIA employees overall felt they handled too much work, but at Alec Station, almost 6 in 10 felt that way. The pressure and the sense of foreboding that informed office life at Alec was not felt widely across the government or in Congress. The analysts and operators were strikingly small in number, considering that Al Qaeda had carried out several successful attacks against the United States, claiming hundreds of lives. ALEC and its counterparts, equally modest in number, at the National Security Council, the FBI, and the National Security Agency were largely on their own, to grind out whatever detection, arrests, and disruptions they could deliver. The CIA's counterterrorism operations in the summer of 2001 often resembled the surveillance operations and criminal investigations carried out domestically by the FBI, with the difference that CTC typically worked overseas, clandestinely, often without regard to the laws of other countries. A common CTC operation involved intensified intelligence collection on a terrorist suspect in an impoverished, unfriendly city like Khartoum or Karachi. That meant operators built a file on a suspect by observing his movements and taking clandestine photographs of his visitors. They might also work with the National Security Agency to tap his phones or hack into his bank accounts or bribe a clerk for the records. A special roster of CIA independent contractors, ex-soldiers, ex-cops, and assorted other adrenaline junkies, carried out the riskiest surveillance and break-in work overseas, because full-time case officers, if caught in the act, likely would have their mugshots publicized by the host government, rendering their expensive training and years-in-the-making cover stories useless. In comparison to career case officers, the contractors were sort of cannon fodder, as one of them put it. Some of them specialized in area familiarization, as it was called, meaning long stakeouts and detailed mapping of a suspect's neighborhood, routes, and routines. The CIA operative also observed local police and intelligence services, so he could plan how to get away if caught. If burglary or planting a listening device was called for, that required a specialized CIA team that resided offshore. These contractors were trained to break into a home or office or embassy, plant a device or steal documents, and get out of the country as fast as possible. The CTC analysts in the basement of new headquarters supported these surveillance and profile-building operations by assessing and logging the photos, wiretaps, and reporting cables that poured in. If CTC wanted to take a suspect off the streets, it typically relied on friendly governments to make arrests. But the center also had the capacity to detain and transport individuals on its own in a procedure called rendition. The CTC's renditions branch would sometimes transfer a terrorism suspect from one country to another for interrogation, including to countries like Egypt, whose military dictatorship had a stark record of torturing detainees. The director of CTC that summer was Kofor Black, a former Khartoum station chief who had worked the Al Qaeda account on and off since the mid-1990s. He was 6'3", perhaps 20 pounds overweight, with thinning hair and a pasty skin tone, befitting a man whose office along one of the basement's walls now ensured that he rarely saw the light of day. His father had been an international airline pilot. Black had spent his childhood in Germany and England before attending boarding school. He had joined the CIA after studying international relations at the University of Southern California. He had spent much of his career as an operations officer in the Africa Division, managing American allies, supplying arms, and working on Somalia's conflicts. The CIA's Africa Division also recruited Soviet, Chinese, Cuban, North Korean, and Iranian diplomats, spies, or defense attachés who were posted to African embassies, where the targeted individuals were far from headquarters and susceptible to compromise. During the Cold War, the division had a reputation among young operations officers as an exciting, unrestrained place of action, adventure, and professional opportunity, but also as a place untethered from headquarters and lacking the prestige and centrality of Moscow, Berlin, or Beijing. After many years in Africa, Black's manner had become theatrical and self-dramatizing. He was a sort of CIA officer one would expect to encounter in an Oliver Stone film. His years abroad had left him with a hard-to-place accent. A touch of South Africa seemed evident. He had proven to be an effective office politician as he rose within CIA. He had a subtler intelligence than his melodramatic speech might suggest, and because he could be funny and generous, he had won the loyalty of senior colleagues. George Tenet had sent him to run CTC in 1999, at a time when the 7th floor, as the CIA's leadership was known, was becoming highly alarmed about Al Qaeda. Black was not a Harvard Business School-inspired manager. Even more than most operations officers, who as a class prided themselves on their ability to freelance and improvise, Black considered it his mission to bend or ignore the CIA's bureaucracy, to concentrate on action and operations. Yet he also managed to keep key superiors on his side. As Khartoum station chief, Black had overseen intelligence collection operations against Osama bin Laden. He tried to infuse CTC with the spirit of streetwise operational gusto that Africa Division considered as its trademark. He brought in Hank Crumpton, who had spent more than a decade as an operations officer in Africa, as his principal deputy. At Alex Station, he inherited Rich Blee, another familiar Africa hand. They recruited others from their old division as well. At 8 a.m. on September 11, 2001, Cofer Black convened a regular briefing meeting in his office. Each week, CTC presented 3 separate update briefings on Al Qaeda to CIA Director George Tenet, James Pavitt, the head of the clandestine service, and A.B. Buzzy Krongard, the agency's executive director. Black asked for a read-in on each briefing before it was delivered. That morning they were scheduled to provide their weekly update to Krongard. Rich Blee walked into Black's office. He was preoccupied by the aftermath of Ahmad Shah Massoud's assassination. Despite Amrul al-Saleh's brave talk, Blee figured that without Massoud's leadership, the Panjshiri resistance to the Taliban would soon collapse. It seemed doubtful that the Bush administration would do anything to prevent that. Yet Blee owed Saleh an answer. Also at the meeting was the head of analysis at CTC, Ben Bonk. He was a Detroit native who evangelized about its corvettes and sports teams, and who had become a specialist in South Asia and Central Asia, at one point serving as National Intelligence Officer for the region. Just after 8:46 a.m., Black's secretary came in to say that a private plane had crashed into the World Trade Center. Black was a licensed pilot, like his father. Glancing at the news coverage on a television mounted in the corner of his office, he could see a hole in the World Trade Center's North Tower. The weather looked clear. He figured the accident involved a light aircraft and that the pilot might have committed suicide. It was an oddity, not necessarily an act of terrorism. A little before 9 a.m., several visitors arrived outside Cofer Black's office. They had no appointment, but they wanted to make a short courtesy call. The group included U.S. Navy Commander Kirk Lippold, who had been at the helm of the USS Coll the previous October when Al Qaeda suicide bombers attacked the ship. He had driven over to the CIA that morning to receive an update from agency analysts about Al Qaeda. Just as he prepared to greet Lippold, a phone on Black's desk rang. His desk had several secure telephone lines, and he wasn't sure how all of them worked. Yet he knew that the one ringing was a non-secure phone for sources or contacts that he didn't want to route through the CIA switchboard. Most of the time when that line rang, the callers were selling credit cards or oil changes. He picked it up. It was an old friend, an officer from the CIA's paramilitary division. They had worked together during the Angolan War. His friend had since risen to a senior position at the agency. He happened that morning to be visiting the CIA's station in New York, which was located in an office building next to the World Trade Center. "Hey, Chief, we've got a problem," the officer said. "I watched this 737-like civilian airliner. I was watching the control surfaces of the aircraft. The pilot flew it into the World Trade Center." He spoke in the clipped vernacular of battlefield operations. "We've been struck. I'm evacuating my position." Rich Blee walked across the hall to Alex Station's cluster of cubicles. "That's bin Laden or Al Qaeda," he said, pointing to a nearby television hanging from the ceiling. "You can't say that," one of his colleagues objected. "It could be an accident. Every time something happens, you can't say that it's Al Qaeda." They stood around arguing. There was a split verdict within Alex Station, but most of the analysts credited the possibility of an accident. ALEC analysts had written warning report after warning report, briefing slide after briefing slide for the White House and the Bush cabinet. They had provided insights for the article in the President's daily brief received by George W. Bush on August 6, 2001, headlined, "Bin Laden Determined to Strike in U.S." "It's Bin Laden," Blee insisted to his colleagues. They were still arguing among themselves at 9:03 a.m. when United Airlines Flight 175 struck the World Trade Center's South Tower. George Tenet raced up the George Washington Parkway to CIA headquarters at about 80 miles an hour. His security detail had pulled him out of a breakfast at a downtown hotel after the first plane hit. Tenet called ahead and asked for the agency's senior leaders to assemble in 7D64, the director's conference room at old headquarters. Cofer Black grabbed an experienced administrative colleague on the CTC staff as he prepared to head upstairs. "Wherever I go today, you come right with me," he told her. "No matter who's there, you come in. I want you to write down every order people give me, because I'm not going to remember them all." At 9:37 a.m., American Airlines Flight 77 struck the Pentagon while flying about 530 miles per hour. In Tenet's conference room, there was a lot of yelling and screaming, as Charles Allen, a 65-year-old agency veteran in charge of intelligence collection, put it. "We have to get out of here," one senior officer exclaimed. "They're heading for us." At 9:40 a.m., Black and Deputy CIA Director John McLaughlin spoke by secure video link with Richard Clark, the lead counterterrorism expert at the White House. Clark said the Federal Aviation Administration was uncertain how many other planes might have been hijacked and still in the air. Several planes were not responding to air controllers, or were squawking signals that might indicate a hijack. There were rumors of a car bombing at the State Department. CTC officers who accompanied Black upstairs mentioned to the group in 7D64 that Ramzi Youssef, the ringleader of the car bombing of the World Trade Center in 1993, had once discussed flying a Cessna packed with explosives into CIA headquarters. And here they all were, packed in together on the building's highest floor. "Let's get out of here," the head of Tenet's personal security detail recommended. "Let's evacuate." "Should we leave?" Tenet asked his senior team. "We should stay here and work on," Charles Allen argued. "Where are we going to go?" Tenet had risen in Washington as a staff member on Capitol Hill, known for his charisma and his succinct, colorful briefings. He explained later that he didn't want the world to think we were abandoning ship, yet he didn't want to risk the lives of our own people unnecessarily, and we needed to have our leadership intact and able to make decisions. He ordered the senior team downstairs. Around 10 a.m., he directed CIA personnel to evacuate the grounds. Within minutes, every computer at the agency flashed "Evacuate" in red. Intelligence officers trudged down the stairwells. The evacuation did not sit well with all of them. It felt like running away. When they got outside, they saw a huge traffic jam as several thousand employees tried to drive out of the campus simultaneously. During the Cold War, the CIA had maintained a secret, bunkered alternate campus to which its leaders could retreat in the event of nuclear war. The alternate campus had been eliminated from the federal budget after the fall of the Berlin Wall. The CIA and its budgeters in Congress had failed to prepare for an emergency on this scale. Tenet's office had the agency's printing plant on the Langley campus as a nearby emergency site if needed. Charles Allen's office had been working to build a new survivable emergency site away from the campus for the CIA and other critical agencies of government, but this was still a work in progress. Tenet now led a march of senior officers toward the CIA printing plant, an outbuilding across the campus. When they reached there, a technician set up a secure terminal equipment, or STE line, to the White House. Tenet raised Stephen Hadley, the Deputy National Security Advisor. President Bush was by now in the air aboard Air Force One, en route to a Louisiana air base. Vice President Dick Cheney had been hustled into a White House bunker. Secretary of Defense Donald Rumsfeld was inside the smoldering Pentagon. Secretary of State Colin Powell was traveling in Latin America. The country's leaders communicated only sporadically, and the attack still seemed to be in progress. Hadley insisted that Tenet keep the STE line open to the White House continuously. Because that channel was occupied, Charles Allen had no way to collect securely the latest intercept reports from the National Security Agency about who might be responsible for the airplane hijackings. Michael Hayden, the NSA director, wanted to send over reports providing preliminary evidence that Al Qaeda was responsible. Allen sent an NSA liaison officer back into CIA headquarters to pull these reports off a secure fax machine and bring them to the printing plant. Tenet talked to leaders at the FBI, the Federal Aviation Administration, State, the National Security Agency, and other counterparts. He also tried to determine whether any CIA officers in the New York station had been killed. None had, it turned out. Cofer Black finally cornered him. All summer, it had been obvious from intelligence reporting that something big and bad was coming. For weeks, Black had been thinking about how he would handle this day. He had tried to imagine in advance a moment of great pressure when a lot of people would be dead and he would have to speak forcefully to CTC's workforce and to his superiors on the 7th floor. "Sir, we're going to have to exempt CTC from the CIA-wide evacuation," Black told Tenet. They would also need to exempt personnel from the Office of Technical Services, which supported CTC. "We need to have our people working the computers." "They're going to be at risk," Tenet answered. "We're going to have to keep them in place. They have the key function to play in a crisis like this." "Well, they could die." "Well, sir, then they're just going to have to die." Tenet thought it over and replied, "You're absolutely right." Black walked back toward new headquarters, into the swarm of evacuating CIA employees. Inside CTC, Black said that their job now was to explain to the President and his cabinet what had just happened to the United States, who did it, and what might be coming next. The Federal Aviation Administration had a liaison officer at CTC. He could access airline passenger manifests. Rich Blee and his Alex Station analysts were by now certain that Al Qaeda had carried out the hijackings, but to make that call firmly for the White House, they needed proof. Blee asked the liaison officer to access the FAA's computers and obtain passenger lists for the 4 known aircraft seized by hijackers. The officer said he could not do that. These were American airliners filled with American citizens, and under the law the CIA could not access private information about U.S. persons, he maintained. Blee was beside himself. He asked FBI agents deployed to Alex Station to see what they could obtain through the Bureau's channels. The Hezbollah branch's analysts at CTC were as certain as the Alec team that the hijackings had been carried out by their terrorists. The attack was a sophisticated, complex operation that required planning and resources. Hezbollah had thousands of fighters in southern Lebanon and a worldwide network strong enough to pull off such a feat. Just a week or two earlier, the branch's analysts had placed a provocative article in the classified National Intelligence Digest, arguing that Hezbollah was a more serious threat to the United States than Al Qaeda. During the past 2 decades, Hezbollah units had bombed American facilities in Saudi Arabia, Kuwait, and Lebanon. The death toll from Hezbollah attacks since the 1980s was higher than the death toll from Al Qaeda strikes, the article had pointed out. "This is Mughniya," one of the Hezbollah analysts assured Blee, referring to Imad Mughniya, then the notorious fugitive leader of Hezbollah's Islamic Jihad organization. "It's not Mughniya," Blee said. Intelligence about a spectacular Al Qaeda attack had been piling up all summer from multiple sources. There was no comparable threat stream about Hezbollah. Yet the Hezbollah analysts were adamant. "Go for it," Blee finally said. "Prove your case." The analysts in Alex Station's cubicles all knew the history of Ramzi Youssef, the architect of the first World Trade Center bombing in 1993. It was 2 years after that when Yusuf had also discussed flying a plane into CIA headquarters. The husband of one analyst worked at the Pentagon, which was now in flames. Other analysts had children at home or school. Blee decided to speak to the group. He was not an easy man to read. He could be blunt. This morning he tried to be calm. The sensation of being under fire was not new to him. But for many Washington-bound analysts at ALEC, this was a first. Blee told them he understood that not everyone would feel that they could stay at work, that some had families they would feel they needed to serve first. It was okay to leave, he said. Still, he continued, the country needs you. We need you. It's hard, but try to stay here. Blee had been reflecting on the fact that a hijacked plane might strike CIA headquarters at any minute. Yet he felt they would survive. A plane would have to fly above the treetops around the CIA campus, and so it would almost inevitably strike the new headquarters' upper floors. Even if the building pancaked, Blee figured, CTC's bunker-like ground floor would survive intact for a while, and there would be time to get outside. Here, at last, was a reason to be grateful for this miserable office space. 5 planes could land on CIA, Blee thought, and his workforce would probably crawl out unharmed, like cockroaches. One of the analysts on the team asked him about the CIA's defenses. One of those planes is probably headed our way. Are there surface-to-air missiles on the roof? Sure, there are surface-to-air missiles, Blee lied. They've got them at the White House. They've got them here, too. His response was spontaneous. He was trying to keep ALEC together. Also, lying effectively was part of a case officer's profession. We're going to war, Blee said. ALEC's days of isolation were over. They would soon be catapulted to the center of national decision-making. Any proposals for attacking Al Qaeda that had earlier been turned down by the 7th floor or the White House should be revived and reconsidered. Use your imagination, Blee said. All but 2 of the ALEC station employees stayed at their desks, according to the recollections of Blee's colleagues. By noon it was clear that the threat of additional kamikaze attacks on Washington had passed. The FBI sent over the passenger manifests for the 4 hijacked airliners by about 1 p.m. ALEC station's analysts typically divided their work by geographical region. Some covered Asia, others the Middle East or Africa. An FBI analyst on assignment to CIA kept track of Al Qaeda's domestic ties. Just a few weeks earlier, while reviewing old cable traffic, she had recognized that a known Al Qaeda associate, Khalid al-Midhar, had obtained an American visa and flown to the United States in early 2000. She had asked the FBI to look for Midhar and a colleague, Nawaf al-Hazmi, but the search had barely started. Now the analyst saw their names on the American 77 passenger list. She approached Blee. "Here's the smoking gun," she said. Did September 11th vindicate the CIA's warnings about Al Qaeda, or expose its failure to prevent a disaster the agency might have stopped? Tenet, Black, and Blee warned the Bush administration about Al Qaeda clearly and repeatedly during 2001. They were not the only people in the government to issue such warnings. Richard Clarke at the National Security Council repeatedly urged Condoleezza Rice and other Bush administration leaders to focus on bin Laden and take more aggressive action. Al-Qaeda specialists at the FBI and the Justice Department also understood well the threat bin Laden posed. In the 2 decades before 2001, the CIA had sometimes failed in its mission to alert presidents in advance to strategic risks and threats abroad. The agency's analysts were late to recognize the forces that swept the Soviet Union away. They were timid about Soviet Premier Mikhail Gorbachev's potential as a reformer. The agency failed to detect or predict India's decision to test a nuclear bomb in 1998. On Al Qaeda, however, in 2001, the CIA had the big picture right and communicated warnings forcefully. In late June, CTC had alerted all station chiefs worldwide about the possibility of an imminent suicide attack, and Tenet asked the chiefs to brief every ambassador. Over the last several months, we have seen unprecedented indications that bin Laden and his supporters have been preparing for a terrorist operation, that CTC bulletin reported. Other CIA warning reports that month carried the headlines, "Bin Laden attacks may be imminent," and "Bin Laden and associates making near-term threats." A daily CIA analytical product, the Senior Executive Intelligence Brief, carried an article on June 30th entitled, "Bin Laden Planning High-Profile Attacks." The CIA did not know when or where the attack would occur, however. Blee said that bin Laden's pattern in the past had been to have his suicide cells attack only when they were ready, not according to any hard schedule. Based on the totality of the intelligence available, Blee said, attack preparations have been made. Multiple and simultaneous attacks are possible, and they will occur with little or no warning. Yet they had no concrete evidence of a plan to strike inside the United States. Their best guess was that Al Qaeda would continue with its established pattern of striking American embassies or defense facilities abroad. Why did the CIA have so little insight into the U.S. plot? Despite several years of field operations and the recruitment of more than 100 reporting agents inside Afghanistan, Alex Station had not penetrated bin Laden's planning. Al Qaeda's counterintelligence against potential moles was formidable. In counterterrorism, strategic warning is vital, but tactical warning about dates and places saves lives. The CIA had not attained that fidelity about Al Qaeda. Worse, as the FBI analysts' instant recognition of the "smoking gun" names on the Flight 77 passenger manifest indicated, agency analysts had possessed for 21 months intelligence that might have led to the disruption of the September 11th conspiracy. Yet CIA analysts in multiple stations and branches had failed to act adequately on its importance. In late 1999, operatives working with Malaysia's Special Branch Police had photographed clandestinely a meeting of suspected Al Qaeda associates in Kuala Lumpur. In January, they discovered Midhar's name and the fact that he had a visa to travel to the United States. In March, they learned his colleague Hazmi's name as well, and the fact that both men had already flown to Los Angeles. Yet they took no action until August 2001. Soon after the information about Midhar and Hazmi was discovered, Doug Miller and Mark Rossini, FBI agents assigned to ALEC, drafted a cable reporting the facts to the FBI. But a CIA officer blocked them from releasing the cable. It is unclear why. The failure to detect and locate Midhar and Hazmi would catalyze blame shifting between the CIA and the FBI for years to come. According to an investigation by the CIA's Office of Inspector General completed in 2005, but not declassified for another 10 years, 50 to 60 individuals read one or more of 6 different CIA cables containing travel information related to these terrorists, meaning Midhar and Hazmi. A majority of those who read the cables worked at CTC. They were mainly CIA analysts, but also included 4 FBI agents on assignment to the agency. The CIA failed to place either Midhar or Hazmi on a State Department-managed terrorist watch list that might have caused the men to be denied entry to the United States or refused visas. The list was not as significant as watch lists would become after September 11th. It did not have a no-fly provision that airlines could automatically access as passengers checked in, for example. Midhar left the United States once after his initial arrival and then returned. So if he had been on the State Department list, he might have been refused entry the second time. That so many individuals failed to act in this case reflects a systemic breakdown caused by excessive workload, ambiguities about responsibilities, and mismanagement of the program, the CIA Inspector General's investigators later concluded. Basically, there was no coherent, functioning watch-listing program. The investigators recommended that a CIA accountability board review Cofer Black, among others, for failing to perform to professional standards, but Porter Goss, the CIA's director when the recommendation was made, chose not to do so. Goss's view was, first, that he was not interested in reprimanding anyone who was no longer at CIA. Black had left government by then. Second, Goss noted that no other agency involved in Homeland Security before September 11th, not the FBI, not the Pentagon, not the Federal Aviation Administration, had felt it necessary to single out any individual for responsibility. Later email records suggest CIA officers believed the information about Midhar and Hazmi had been conveyed to the FBI. CIA analysts told the Inspector General that they had communicated the details informally over the telephone. Yet there is no documentary evidence to support these recollections, according to the Inspector General. His investigators found no evidence and heard no claim from any party that this information was shared in any manner with the FBI or that anyone in Alex Station took other appropriate operational action at that time. Well into 2001, various analysts reviewed the files, but failed to recognize the significance of their information until it was too late. These failures are an indelible part of the what-if history of September 11th. The possibility that the attacks might have been stopped, that thousands of lives might have been spared, and that America's foreign policy might not have pivoted in costly directions. Yet that counterfactual requires a context. The gross domestic product of the United States in 2001 was about $10.6 trillion. The budget of the federal government was about $1.8 trillion. In fiscal 2001, the government enjoyed a $128 billion operating surplus. Yet counterterrorism teams at the CIA and the FBI, working on Al Qaeda and allied groups, received an infinitesimal fraction of the country's defense and intelligence budget of roughly $300 billion, the great majority of which went to the Pentagon to support conventional and missile forces. Bush's national security deputies did not hold a meeting dedicated to plans to thwart Al Qaeda until September 4, 2001, almost 9 months after President Bush took the oath of office. The September 11th conspiracy succeeded in part because the democratically elected government of the United States, including the Congress, did not regard Al Qaeda as a priority. In the first days and months after the attack, in any event, the country had scant appetite for reflection or accountability. President Bush needed answers and plans for retaliation, and the CIA had them. September 11th empowered the Counterterrorist Center and its leaders. It put the CIA in a commanding position within the Bush National Security Cabinet. With a degree of influence over national policy the agency had not enjoyed at the White House since the days of anti-communist proxy guerrilla war during the 1980s. Overnight, Cofer Black and Rich Blee and their colleagues, promoted by their persuasive boss, George Tenet, became vital authors of American military and foreign policy. They proceeded under certain assumptions. They believed that CTC's covert action against bin Laden after 1998 had been hamstrung by caution and fecklessness at the White House and among the CIA's leaders. They feared what might be coming next, and believed they had to act quickly. Their aggression in the coming weeks was not about violence, Black insisted later, although we used the vocabulary of violence to shock and impress and inspire various constituencies. They needed to move fast in order to cause Al Qaeda's leaders to turn their attention away from planning or executing follow-on attacks, to concentrate instead on self-preservation. "The gloves are off," they told colleagues, a phrase that rapidly spread around the agency and the Capitol as a dangerous, facile cliché. The professional histories of Black, Blee, and others in leadership at the Counterterrorist Center that September included long exposure to unconventional war in Africa, arming and training proxy armies, working behind the scenes with small teams of paramilitaries, empowering strong men while accepting that few guerrilla leaders were morally admirable. They preferred to let the locals carry the fight, enabled by the CIA's money and technology, following a script that traced back to the secret operations of the Office of Strategic Services during the Second World War, which laid the CIA's foundations. The Defense Department typically required weeks or months to build the logistics tail to support overseas ground operations. The CIA's value to the White House over decades, part myth, part valid history, had always been that 100 operations officers with M4 rifles could go anywhere in a week and create mayhem without a lot of care and feeding. Black's conception of the CIA as the anti-military, as he put it, required improvising very fast. The American public, shocked and angry on September 11th, ready to support retaliation, had no acquaintance with the men in the CTC bunker. Yet the center's leaders would define the country's initial reply to bin Laden: a paramilitary war in Afghanistan, a counter-terrorist campaign against Al Qaeda worldwide. And they would influence many of the legal, political, and diplomatic strategies that would shape those campaigns. The coming war in Afghanistan would follow Africa Division rules. Shortly after 3 p.m. on September 11th, Tenet told President Bush during a secure video conference that the CIA was certain Al Qaeda had carried out the hijackings. He went through the names and case histories of Midhar and Hazmi, and the fact that they had been passengers on Flight 77. This was an Al Qaeda operation, the CIA director reported. Rich Blee called Amrullah Saleh in Dushanbe on their secure line. Saleh had been watching the news coverage, but he wasn't sure what the attacks would mean for America's willingness to arm the Council of the North. Saleh certainly did not expect the United States to invade Afghanistan. At most, if Massoud's men were lucky, the CIA might open its checkbook a little more generously, he thought. Saleh had made more lists since his last call with Blee. He had written up an inventory of weapons and military gear the Panjshiri guerrillas might need to hold the valley against the Taliban and Al Qaeda. Saleh started to read off his list. Blee interrupted him. "This is a tragedy for my country, but it is going to change your country forever," Blee said. The American response to the hijackings was going to involve much more than an increased supply of grenades and helicopters. "This is now much beyond you," Blee continued. "Consult your leaders, because this is going to come in ways, in scope and in scale, that you cannot imagine." There was a psychologist working at CTC, an expert on terrorism. She mentioned to Cofer Black that he should probably talk to the center's workforce to address their emotions. Black asked her to walk around a little and take in the mood. "Should I give one of my motivational speeches?" he asked after she had done so. "These aren't operators," she advised him. "They need reassurance. You're their father. Speak to them like that." Black was accustomed to supervising case officers doing risky work. The style of speech these officers appreciated was derived from fired-up football coaches exhorting young men in locker rooms. Yet the CTC analysts at new headquarters in Virginia had graduate degrees. They did not respond especially well to entering the jaws of hell talk. Black made some notes. He called the workforce together on September 13th. "It really pains me to tell you this, but by the time this is all over, at the victory parade, we will not all be there," Black said. He guessed privately that around 4 or 5 dozen CIA personnel would perish or be captured in the coming fight in Afghanistan and elsewhere. He was trying to sensitize the group to the losses he foresaw, and to encourage them to appreciate the friends and colleagues they saw in the hallway. There was silence. A few wept. He tried to lighten the mood. He told them what he had been doing over the last 48 hours. He had met with President Bush. The president had already given him a nickname, Heifer, because apparently Bush couldn't remember Cofer, and "I am sort of a hefty guy." Black also told them that his favorite movie was Bill and Ted's Excellent Adventure, a 1989 science fiction comedy about 2 teenage slackers who use a time machine to travel through history. Even those around him who were crying laughed. "Be excellent to each other," Black went on. "Give everyone a break. We're all doing the best we can." He was thinking about a colleague on the analytical side of CTC who had reported that her neighbor had confronted her and told her that she was partly responsible for September 11th, sending her into tears. These were dark days, Black felt. Many in CTC were racked by guilt. The emotions were raw, and he struggled, too, to hold a measured tone. He added, "If you remember one thing from this, I'd like it to be that we're the good guys, and we're going to win."